Good morning, everyone out there in internet land. Welcome to the most recent installment of our NAAFA webinar series. I am Tigress Osborn. I'm the Director of Community Outreach for NAAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. And NAAFA is a 50-year-old, almost 50-year-old civil rights organization working to protect and create more legal rights for fat folks and supported by folks of all sizes who love fat folks. We are an all-volunteer organization, and if you are interested in membership or in helping us celebrate that 50th anniversary at our national conference next summer in Las Vegas, Nevada, you can find more information about those things on our website. This morning we're going to be talking about intersectionality and the fat liberation movement. And I am joined this morning by Tammy Johnson and Caleb Luna, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Tammy, would you start with, first of all, let our audience know your pronouns, and then anything you want them to know about your biography.
Sure. Happy Saturday, everybody. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. What about me? So I am partner of a firm called Artwork Practice. We do work primarily around racial equity in the arts with an intersectional lens. So we work with artists and arts organizations and also social justice groups that want to integrate the arts into their work. I've been doing racial equity work in particular for 20 years now. Started as a community organizer in Milwaukee and moved to the Bay Area in 2000. And have done everything from policy work to community work, training, a little bit of everything. I'm also a belly dancer. My style is Egyptian style belly dance. I've been dancing for over 15 years. For many years, for most of that time, I was in a dance company with another belly dancer, A-Tang I-Yang. Hi, A-Tang, if you're out there somewhere. And a group called Rocks Africa, and we ran a nonprofit called Girls Rocks Belly Dance and Body Image Program. I now am a soloist and have an organization called Project AWA, which deals with the cultural arts of Northern Africa. That's a bit about me. I've also been involved in the fat activist community for probably about roughly a decade or so in various ways, and I'm really happy to be here today.
Thank you. Caleb.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caleb Luna. I use they and them pronouns. I am a fat person. I am a writer, a performer. I write poetry. Most of my work has, so far my work has been circulated on online publications like Everyday Feminism and The Body is on an Apology and Black Girl Dangerous. I'm also currently a PhD student in performance studies at UC Berkeley, and I'm looking at how bodies come to have meaning, how bodies are given meaning, particularly, and using fatness as an entry point into that question. But my framework considers always that bodies come to have meaning, not just through fatness, but with race, gender, class, sexuality, and all of their intersections as well. I think that's well.
Thank you. And I'm also realizing that I sort of assume that y'all are NAAFA folks who know me, and I know we may have some guests who are not familiar with me, and definitely know that we have some folks who are dialed in from all over the world this morning. Thank you all for being here, especially those of you who are in time zones that make this really uncomfortable for you to be here. I'm Tigress Osborn. As I said, I'm the Director of Community Outreach for NAAFA. I've been on the NAAFA board for, I think, a little over 3 years now. Was first introduced to NAAFA as a college student by the career development officer at my school, who talked about fat rights at our school's diversity day. So I've been aware of fat activism for many years, but really when I sort of geared up in my fat activism was when I started a plus-size nightclub event here in the Oakland area called Full Figure Entertainment. And I really wanted that event to be like, I wanted it to be like the hottest party around on the party nights, but I wanted it to come from a platform that supported the activist work that I could see in my community. So I was, to my knowledge, the only fat party that had a mission and value statement that talked about fat activism. And at the time I was using the term size acceptance. I want to talk to y'all a little bit about the terminology that we use about fat work. But yeah, so I've been doing that, you know, for about 10 years now, and also very active in the Bay Area's fat dance community and other forms of activism here in the Bay. So that's me. At the end, we'll recap how you can find all of us online if you're interested in following us further in our work. Okay, so before we talk about the definition of intersectionality, let's talk about fat liberation, what that term means to you, what you think about other terms that are used for the work that we do around trying to affirm fat humanity. I don't want to say establish fat humanity because we know we're human, but some other people don't always act like they know that. What are the terms you like, or what are terms that you find challenging around fat activist work?
That's a good question. I'm totally fine with that. Fat liberation, for me, it means that I have the right to be how I want to be. Period. Just be. That I don't have to adjust for someone else's comfort or expectations. That I can show up and be fully who Tammy is. And that's, for me, you know, ironically, I would probably say that about fatness, about my blackness, about my womanness, that I can show up and be all of that and not have to check any of that at the door or muffle that or be overly concerned about someone else's concern about that or judgment. That I know I can show up in a crop top, I can show up sleeveless, I can show up and spread out, or show up and feel dainty and cute and girly, and all of that in this fat body, and it's not only okay, but it's glorious. That's what it means.
Yeah.
You know, all of the terminology, you know, my feeling about terminology is that, like, whether it's around the fat community or other communities, is that these things change as we get more knowledge and understanding, and that at some level we have to have compassion for each other because we're all learning and trying to figure out how to be free, and we're going to make mistakes in that, right? So as long as the terminology isn't about being hateful and othering, I'm open to, like, hearing what that's about.
Okay. One of the reasons I stopped using size acceptance as my primary term. Like, I definitely still use it. I especially still use it for hashtags online for things because it is a recognizable term and one that has been used about fat activism for a long time. But there's this sort of dialogue in social justice communities about the difference between acceptance, tolerance, acceptance, and actual embracing, celebration, welcoming. And so I wanted to be reinforcing language that was a little bit further along that spectrum of being unapologetic about it, or like not really asking people to accept me, but just being like, this is what me and my people are going to do, whether y'all like it or not. And so I started using size celebration as the term that we used at FFE, and then, you know, started using fat liberation more, using that term more widely. What do you like, Caleb?
Yeah, I really like fat liberation, which I guess for me means that there is no limit to your humanity, right? Either it's particularly around fatness, so there's not a size where you stop becoming human, or you stop becoming, like, a lot of pushback I feel like around these issues is like, oh, I'm fine with, like, body positivity, but, like, health is really important, or whatever, like, as long as you're healthy. And fat liberation is not about health and health status. Fat liberation means that you can be however your body is, with love and care and support, and having your needs met, judgment-free, and that you just have, like, a right to exist as you are, and again, with no limits. And I think, yeah, the difference between I feel like body positivity has, like, really, really circulated a lot, and it, again, is, like, a really recognizable term, and I like it in that, you know, we all have issues with our bodies no matter what our size is. Like, capitalism is really insistent on making us hate ourselves, and so everybody, no matter what your size is, like, probably has some sort of, like I am really amazed at the kinds of, like, insecurities thin people can make up about, like, their bodies. Like, or in my experience, like, thin folks can pick themselves apart to a degree that it never occurred to me, right? And they can, like, be so, yeah, like, I don't know what the demographic is, but there's that, like, famous scene in Mean Girls where they're all, like, looking in front of the mirror and being like, oh my god, like, my chin is so whatever, like, just, and so, like, body positivity is important so that folks who maybe don't experience fat phobia or size-based oppression can still learn to unlearn the internalized hate that capitalism has instilled in us. But body positivity doesn't always mean fat liberation or fat positivity even. Body positivity frequently, I think the way that it's been taken up and circulated is in this way of, like, I'm reclaiming my body from the things that, like, have made me feel insecure about myself, but still within a framework of normative health and normative size and normative attractiveness. And so that doesn't, and sure, that's pushing the conversation forward for a demographic of people, but it is not liberating us, right? It's still maintaining a particular norm that is really difficult to access. And so fat liberation for me is it centers fatness, because as people who are the targets of size-based oppression, liberating fat people would necessarily liberate us all from our insecurities. Many people's insecurities are about becoming fat or getting fatter, and if there's no longer a limit to what our humanity is, that fear will be removed. And that's something that we can only achieve with fat liberation. Body positivity doesn't take us there. Another term that I feel like is related is, like, the circulation of thick with 2 C's, which is another way that, like, I think particularly young people are trying to reclaim their bodies if they're not thin. And also, again, like, the different kinds of ways that people have developed to categorize their bodies is interesting to me. And, like, I don't always understand the difference between, like, thin and skinny or what, like, however these people, like,
yeah.
I'm just like, you whatever. Like,
well, it's so contextual. I mean, even fat, right? Like,
yeah,
it's so contextual because, so many people think they're fat because they were told they were fat, or they're the fattest one in their family, or they're, they. And so I think it's important when we talk about privilege. We're going to talk a little bit about privilege, and when we do talk about privilege, I think it's important to distinguish between people who are fat in ways that actually affect the way they move physically in the world and that affect the ways that they are seen in terms of their humanity, versus people who are fat in ways that like they've been teased by their big brother,
right.
or like, somebody said something mean to them on a date. Like, those things are important, and they are real in terms of, like, your emotional landscape, but that's not the same thing as when I get on a plane, people don't want to sit next to me, or I literally can't sit there without getting an extra seat. Or things like, my rights as a parent are being challenged because people think I'm too fat to play with my kids. That's very different than, like, I don't wear the same size I wore in high school and I feel personally traumatized by that.
Right.
And so I think that context is always, like, really important when we talk about fat oppression versus just body negativity, right?
Yeah, I think something that will hop over all of these issues, whether it's specific around fat oppression, or when we go back to intersectionality or privilege, is A, context does matter, and B, how systems respond to these matters. Right? There's the interpersonal engagement that is real, like how people in your family, people in your workplace, or even workplace involved systems, but that's that interpersonal dating life kind of thing, right? That's one piece of it that's real. But what I think with all of these things that don't usually get discussed in a thorough way is how systems respond to us. The lack of laws and policies to protect us. What doesn't protect us? What actually even mandates that we get treated a certain way, like the way doctors are trained, right?
Or the way doctors are not trained.
Are not trained, right?
But
so, that's the piece of conversation that's also really important to really understand any kind of system of oppression. Is I think you're in a system, and that's, I think, really hard for people in the United States to grapple, because we're in a society where the narrative is all about the importance of the individual and individual merit, and everything that you have achieved in life is because of your own individual effort, and it's disconnected to how we're connected as people, and how systems on a daily basis, have impacts on all of us, positive and negative.
So I think that's actually a really good transition point to talk more explicitly about what intersectionality means. Because what you just said about sort of the individual versus community, I think is really important to that. I know that you brought with you a little bit of history about the term. Would you share that with the audience who's watching us today?
Sure. So the term was coined by a Black woman who's a professor of law at the University of California, LA, at Columbia. Her name is Kimberly Crenshaw, and she actually released a essay in '89 called "Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex: A Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics." And Crenshaw was also, I believe, the lead attorney, at least on the support team of Anita Hill as well. And she coined this term as a means of identifying how, particularly, what she was talking about was feminism and racial equity work, but how people silo them, right? And one of the things that she has brought up recently is how they're oftentimes talked about as identities and outside of context and structure. So her theory is like you really can't silo these things. I mean, she was definitely down with Audre Lorde that we don't live single issue lives, right? But it wasn't for her just about understanding the different identities. And I think this is an important point, because I think oftentimes what we see in memes and a lot of pieces is intersectionality presented just as you have to understand people's identities. While that is important, what she was really getting to is like how systems actually pit us against each other and actually use people's identities as a means of maintaining systems of oppression, right? And so it's not just about people have multiple identities and multiple privileges and multiple marginalizations, right? So on one hand, in terms of privilege, I'm a college-educated woman. I live a middle-class lifestyle. I have citizenship status in the U.S., right? And I do have certain things that I have privileges, and then I have identities that have been marginalized by society, right? I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm fat, right? And I can go on and on about all of those. And all of those things are of importance on their own, but to really have a full discussion about how I move in the world, I also have to talk about how the world comes to me,
right,
and sees me when I walk in the door, and what is not seen when I walk into the door. And like, there's all kinds of written and unwritten rules and rituals, and we'll also talk about customs and traditions, right? Not just what government does, but what people and community do.
Right.
And sometimes we romanticize our community's customs and traditions, and some of that stuff is messed up too, right? And that stuff is also part of systems.
Right.
It's just how we do things around here, right? So she really wanted people to say, we need to stop trying to silo, and that both all of these areas need to have some time to actually understand each other and recognize how systems play into it, right? And I think that's the part that gets forgotten of her teaching, right? It's like identities do matter, but also what systems do to those identities also matter.
Yeah.
And how they pit one against the other.
One of the things I find as people start to first be introduced to the term intersectionality is that they want to gravitate to the easiest part of it, which is the idea that there are these ways that we have things in common, even though we're different. So, so you're this and you're that and I'm that, but we're all fat. So the only important thing right now is that we're all fat. We can forget about all those other things and just talk about what unifies us. And it's actually a very lovely sentiment and a very useful sentiment, but not when we are also trying to talk about the ways that systems interact with those other identities.
I mean, I think that's another way in the United States we're conditioned, and that's another, taboo thing. People don't want to believe that they're conditioned, that they're being controlled, and actually it's just true. We are conditioned and controlled in so many ways.
And more so if you're in denial of that.
Right. But one of the conditioning is that we want it simple and easy, right? For decades, Hollywood's produced films where there were happy endings, and that was intentional, right? And it was part of our conditioning, and there's supposed to be a nice wrap up at the end of a 22-minute TV show, right? Right? And I think with these issues, we actually have to do the opposite and get comfortable in the complexity, to expect complexity. And maybe in this one instance, be a little bit more like Europeans and those really complex European films that don't resolve at the end. Right? Because we're human beings. Human beings are complex. And when you fully embrace all of who you are and bring that to the room, that's going to make things messy. That's going to make things that, the usual is not going to work. Right?
So one of the things that I think is important in terms of thinking about intersectionality today is that intersections, is that one of the identity categories that we want to be thinking about is class, socioeconomic class, and formalized education is part of that, being academic or, be literally in the academy, Caleb, but also having that identity as scholarly, and since some of the intersectionality was really introduced academically. It wasn't a layperson's term that was used all the time, right? And in activist community, we can often be a lot more academic than mainstream folks. That's part of that difference between body positivity and fat liberation, right? It's a more politicized understanding of things, and that often comes out of academia. And so I was thinking about how do we define these terms in sort of 101 ways, and then I realized that was actually a pretty classist way to language it, because folks who don't have experience with formalized higher education don't necessarily know that 101 is the beginning level class, right? So even talking about it that way, I was trying to be intersectional in thinking about class issues and thinking about making the webinar accessible to folks that don't have the same kind of formal education as maybe the three of us do. And then I was using the language of that system to even think about how to not do it in the way of that system.
Yeah.
You know, how do you make it easier for folks who are unfamiliar with the academy, but without being condescending?
Yeah, well, I think one thing that we need to remember is that while like the actual concept and term intersectionality is like very much it's like the specific word intersectionality does come out of the academy, but the concept, like, people have been writing about it for years in so many different ways, right? And so I think it's something also that people without these formal educations like definitely understand and are potentially even already aware of. And it's just like kind of developing a common language to get so that we can all like, yeah, communicate in the same way, right? Or so that we all, you know, like when I think part of the value of having like a concrete term like intersectionality to point to is that we can, like when we use the word, we have like this history behind it. And so that we're all like informed by a particular kind of framework that wants to look at all the various intersections.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also I forgot where I was going.
Think about it. Interrupt me to come back to it.
One of the things I think about whenever we're talking about like any of these terms is what I've learned in doing trainings around these issues is that you always have in any given group the spectrum of knowledge and understanding from people who have like taught it or who took an ethnic or women's studies class in college or who have taken trainings through their workplace or in a community to people who have done none of that but kind of understand it at this gut level but don't have the word.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, then my job is to say if we're all going to be working together, regardless of where you are in that spectrum, we have to all have the same understanding because oftentimes people get different definitions and different understandings of the same and conflate things, right? So it's like, so even if you've been there, done that, your definition of understanding may not be the same one as someone who's like been in a training. So let's get on one page by like just laying it out and coming to an agreement about what it is. That's useful for everybody on all of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And oftentimes that person who has nothing to do with academia or social justice, who have only like kind of known it at their gut, I'm actually happy that someone has spelled it out because it validates what they thought and gives them language finally for what they thought, what they've been thinking and what they've been feeling. And that's a service too.
And those of us who have come through the academy but did not come from that world, like you know, first generation to college, that kind of thing, like those we've had that experience of like, oh, there is this other way to talk about this and these, you know, other words to use to talk about these things. But then we also have the experience of, if y'all are not familiar with the term code switching, you know, we talk about that as sort of like using language in one way in one community, but using it in a different way in another community. It's often used to talk about like using formal sort of standard English, versus using other kinds of dialects or vernacular or just kind of ways of talking, and that's one of the things that happens when you're not from the academy and you go into the academy and then you have to do this code switch because you still want to talk to your home community, but now you have this other academic community that you're part of, right? And so I think that's a really good example of that. I wanted to share one historical example because of a way to think about intersectionality, because I think it's not specific to fatness, but I think many of you will be familiar with the example. If you know Sojourner Truth's speech from the Seneca Falls Convention, right? It's usually known as the Ain't I a Woman speech. And it's about like how, you know, it's 1849 or something, and like please forgive me if I'm not getting all the specifics of this. I haven't taught this in many years, and it just came to me now. But, just so like there's this convention, and it's about women's rights. It's a women's rights convention, and except it's about white women's rights, clearly. And so Journal Truth, who is a former slave, stands up and makes this really impassioned speech about, like, I am also a woman. Here are all these things that I have done that y'all say women don't. Y'all say women are frail and can't do all these things. And I've worked like a man. I've had all these children. I've lived, this completely different life than what y'all are defining as womanhood. And I am also a woman. There's not one universal definition of womanhood that excludes me. Y'all just think there is because you're defaulting to the one that matches you. Right? And so I will try to remember later to share the link to that speech on the Facebook event of this. I'm sometimes bad at remembering to do that, but it's Sojourner Truth, and if you just Google "Ain't I a Woman," you'll find it. And you'll find many famous Black actresses on YouTube doing renditions of it. But it's a great example of that like, we thought we were talking about everybody. Well, because we were talking about everybody who's like us. Hello? Not exactly.
Yeah.
So talk to me about how that happens in that community.
Wow. Good question. How that happens in that community?
Well, one thing that I want to tease out about intersectionality is that, like, when Crenshaw coined it, she was specifically talking about race and gender, and now it's been taken up to include so many different other things that inform our embodiments and our identities and our experiences in the world. And one of those things is size, right? And so whenever we were talking earlier about, like, the broad category that fat is, and that, like, there are so many people who I would consider thin who identify as fat, right? Because they're much smaller than me, and, like, from my vantage point, like, that's thinness. But for them, it's not. And so we have to think about size as one intersection. And one thing that I think, one way this happens in fat community, I think, is that smaller fat people, we use the term smaller fat people, or, like, bigger fat people, or super size, to kind of distinguish, like, the different experiences that happen at each level, right? Because it is the difference between maybe only experience, or not only, but primarily experiencing, like, these interpersonal dynamics like we were speaking about earlier versus systemic. And so I think one thing with fat community is smaller fat people are kind of can be really centered and can really forget about, or maybe it's not fair to, like, only put this on smaller fat people. But yeah, we forget about the differences that our size and our shape give us, right? As well as our race and our gender and our sexuality. And, like, it's very different to be a fat straight woman than it is to be a fat queer woman, right? Like, those communities have very different histories in regards to fatness. And so, yeah, that's one way where, like, we collapse all of our other experiences into just fatness that doesn't really string out the nuances.
But when we start focusing on all, like, we can't focus on all these different directions. And when we do that, don't we just dilute our message about fatness if we're trying to y'all know I'm asking.
Yeah.
It's not my question. I'm asking a question I've heard often. Like, why don't we have to focus on fatness right now? If we start talking about all these other things, we're not going to be talking about fatness anymore, and we're not going to do anything about the way fat people are oppressed.
I think that's an expression of the lack of acknowledgement of how systems work, and, like, how dominant expressions of the systems dominate everything.
Mm-hmm.
So when you don't name it, it will default to the dominant, right? So when you say it's about everything and everyone, it'll default usually to whiteness, cisness, maleness, and we can go down the line.
Right.
Right?
I'm going to pause you for just a second, because I know from doing these webinars that often cis is not a term that people are familiar with.
Okay.
Will you say what that is?
Oh, I probably don't have the best definition, but I will.
Will you say what that is?
Cis is a term to describe somebody who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. So we're all assigned a gender at birth based on our genitals. And if you grow up in that gender, your gender identity matches the gender you were assigned with at birth, then you're a cis person. If it doesn't, if your gender changes and for whatever reason, you can fall under the trans umbrella or spectrum.
So just to finish that thought, so like I said, when you don't specify, what ends up happening 98% of the time is the default of the mainstream will take over, right? The other piece of that is going back to embracing the complexity. If you don't name all of the different stuff, you can't get to how do we have alternatives and solutions that fit all of those folks. So while it's what's happening, for instance, just to step back into a bigger example, in the tech world today, they say we want to diversify in tech, right? And so they do the 1980s diversity thing, and they get a few women and a few people of color, and they have no power, and those people turn over like crazy because you've done nothing to your corporation, to your business, to your industry to really shift balance of power. And power dynamics is huge in this conversation. Who has power to say, what looks like, and also you also end up, and this is what I have seen in fact spaces, you end up defaulting to aesthetics, right? So yeah, we have checked all the aesthetic boxes, and we're serving tacos tonight, and
the optics look good, but
the optics look good,
work for people.
But there's clearly a difference in power dynamics. Who gets to say put a green light on the project, right, and gets to craft it, and the voice. Who's leading that project?
Well,
right?
and one thing that happens a lot, I think, with fat activists, especially folks who have become or started as more mainstream in body positivity, is that it's the who gets listened to, who gets paid attention to, who gets the media story, who gets the 100,000 followers instead of 20,000 followers, because it just snowballs in a different way for them because
power
of who they are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. The other way I see this showing up in fat communities is because of the lack of real embracing of everyone. I see less, particularly fat, at least in the community I'm in, maybe in other parts of the country, fat gay men of color. And, that's not my community. I want to say that. And but from conversing with folks in that community, that's a community where definitely there's some allyship and some community around fatness that's needed, right? And here we have in the Bay Area, compared to a lot of places, a significant base of fat activism, and this whole gobs of people that are not being reached, because when I go to an event, I see a lot of fat white women. And, the queerness is growing and has always been there. I've been around the fat community for 10 years. The queerness that I've seen, right?
And I think too, we should footnote there that when you look at fat activist history, NAAFA itself was started by a cisgender straight white man, but other areas of fat activism were very much queer women were foundational.
I totally believe that. So then you have to ask yourself the question, what's not happening? And then it becomes a question of what usually happens is how do we bring those people to us? And that's the wrong question. The question is when do you go to them? When do you go to their parties and engage them and engage them on their terms?
And that's super challenging.
And build a relationship so that they feel like, oh, I know you now. Now I can come to a fat event, right?
Well, and I think that's super challenging because I think one of the things that people worry about, people who are trying to be intersectional and are kind of fumbling their way through it, right? Because this stuff is complicated. It's complicated all the time. Well, if they're having an event and it's a bunch of fat gay men, maybe I shouldn't go there because that's an affinity space for them, and I should not put my white face in that event.
And that's a good question, and that may be the case. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, you should absolutely ask yourself that and figure that out, because maybe you shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
That's true. Every space isn't for everybody.
Right.
So, yes, but then again, there are spaces that are open. That, you know, we don't see people engaging. And here's the thing. It takes time. What we're really talking about is building a real relationship that is meaningful with depth and not just for the sake of functionality and the transaction of, oh, we want to see more of you at our event. No. If you're building a real relationship, you invest some time and effort, right, before you expect anything, quite frankly. And that's just what it takes, no matter what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And I think, or when you were saying, like, if we bring in these other issues, then we're going to drift away from fatness as, like, a reason to not engage in intersectional thinking. And I'm like, when I hear that, it just seems like it sounds white to me, and I know that it's white, because if this is the only, if you're privileging fat oppression as like the primary or priority, then that means that it's the only oppression you face, right? And so that means that for you it's maybe not connected to anything else, but for others, like, it is not the only oppression that I face. And it is, I think fatness is racialized. Fatness is class. Most of the people in the United States who are fat are poor people of color. And I think that's also a big part of fat stigma, that it signifies that sort of class status and that sort of racialization, even if you are not either poor or a person of color. Like, you are still kind of being visually linked to this community. And that's what that's part of the stigma of fatness, right, is that
that you'll be more like those people.
Yes, that you're like a lower status person because of your proximity to these other groups of people.
Well, and often when we think about fat whiteness, we often, especially in mainstream media, are talking about fat white poor people.
Right, absolutely. Who, again, like, when we think about whiteness is an aspiration, it's an ideal, it's not a material reality. So being white being a white fat person doesn't necessarily mean that you're like, you absolutely like have access to white privilege, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are living up to the ideals of whiteness, right? Like, there are other white people who are still pushing you down. And that's how you can tell that you're not living up to those standards. So we have to think about race and class, but particularly when we think about fatness, because not just thinking, and not to like invoke a narrative that fat people are fat because of our eating habits. I'm not interested in that. And like, if that's the case, then that's irrelevant. Like, but it does mean that we have to think about other systems and structures of oppression.
Well, I think there may be some relevance in talking about what fat people eat when you are talking about food justice and how it affects some of the communities where we see larger numbers of fat folks. So there's some relevance that way. And then it gets complicated, right? So you can see, we don't want to talk about food, but actually in this one way, maybe we do need to talk about food because it's actually about economics and access and, and other things like that. Before we go to Q&A, thanks all of you out there. We're going to get to some questions from you in just a second. I want to have y'all talk explicitly about the term fat is the last acceptable prejudice.
That, to me, is a non-starter conversation. That is, it plays into what people call the oppression Olympics. right? Like, my oppression is worse than yours, and let me tell you how. It is the inability to hold complexity, right? That it's not this binary or either or, that mine comes before that. It's about, in order to get to real solutions and alternatives, we have to have all of that discussion because they all bump into each other.
But isn't it true that somebody can go on TV and make a horrible joke about fat people, or make an entire Netflix TV show that is specifically about someone in a fat suit, and and people will let that happen? You could never have a blackface show. You can have a fat suit show, but you can never have a blackface show. So isn't that evidence that it's worse for fat people than it is for black people?
Absolutely not.
Please
Absolutely not.
Elaborate. Please let me not be the one elaborating.
Absolutely not. I mean, if you live in a black body day by day, that's proof against that argument, for one. And, I mean, really what we're talking about is that we're at a time, especially with social media and the politics of the day, where everything is heightened. Everything is urgent. And there's also that at the same time where there's this heightened sense of competition and scarcity, right? And so if there's not enough justice for everyone, I better get mine. Mm-hmm. And that's leveraging all kinds of people against each other, around size, around class, around race. So to even engage in that discussion is a divide and conquer that I'm not even going to go with. Like, if you're committed to that, then go somewhere else with that. Because I live in a world that reacts to me as a fat black woman who don't see as someone who's aging some growing disabilities that I'm having, right? And I gotta figure out how to live in this world. And part of that for me is like not saying, well, today my blackness takes precedence. Because, you know, a brother's going to come up to me and say something very sexist to me. and that holds all kinds of capacity there.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, it really stops the conversation in its tracks. And it should. Because what you're saying to me is that all I care about is this one thing. Mm-hmm. And I can't afford to do that and live in this world. And actually, most people can't, right? Even, you know, you could be a cis white lesbian. They can't afford to look through one lens if they're real about their lives, right? There's very few people who, if they're real and really understand what's going on, can only look at their lives through a very narrow lens. And it negates that, like, we're interrelated here. We're interconnected, right? So that fat suit on that TV show, as was said, is not just talking about fatness. It's also talking about class. It's also talking about race. And if you can't see that complexity, then there's some work that needs to be done, right? And so, again, I think that goes to, like, this really happy ending, quick and easy mentality we have in this country of we want it simple and we don't want to deal with complexity. And actually, complexity is not only beautiful, but it's urgent and necessary to understand it, to get to real complex solutions. So it's a non-starter conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some truth to the fact that there are I feel like there is cultural tolerance for fatphobia in a way that there maybe isn't as explicitly for other areas of marginalization or oppression. And I think that to some extent is true that, and I think that particularly being like a queer person of color, being in activist spaces, like I see, and in spaces where people have, you know, really broad intersectional analyses, that are anti-racist about like are feminist, are queer, but might still be holding on to some fatphobia. And I think that that's pretty common.
In fact, I actually have found it to be that sometimes the people who are most identified with the term progressive and most interested in intersectionality in other ways are the most fatphobic because they're the least exposed to some of the things that we just talked about around class and body size.
Yeah,
and so, or they want to be the least exposed to that. Like, I've actually found that sometimes outside of explicitly fat positive spaces, other so-called progressive people are actually more fatphobic than other so-called conservative people.
Right. And there's like, because there's so much, I think, in that statement.
Absolutely.
But I just want to be clear that, like, just because we can, that I think in some ways it is more acceptable to be really explicitly fatphobic in ways that it is less acceptable to be really explicitly racist, which also is still pretty culturally acceptable in many, many ways. There's not nearly enough outreach around systemic structural interpersonal racism as there should be. But that doesn't mean that it's the last valid, like that we are still so complicit in so many oppressions. And just because one of them is maybe at different times like much more visible doesn't mean that it's like the only thing that's happening.
Right. And I think like if you're really about advancing fat liberation, that statement actually puts you 10 steps back. Mm-hmm. Right? Like if the urgency or the motivation behind that statement is to raise the radar around fat liberation, then that's the wrong statement to make. Because now it's about competition and being defensive. Mm-hmm. That's not the framework, that's not the conversation you really want to have. You know, you really want to have where can we be in solidarity with each other? You know, where can we broaden the framework of what is quote unquote normal that are taken outside of the systems that are in play now, and we'll bust that envelope altogether, right? I mean, I think part of it is to have people think about what are you trying to achieve by making that statement, and showing them that like actually what you're trying to achieve, that statement gets you nowhere near that. It gets you farther from that. Like you're not going to gain an ally from anyone who belongs to any of those other communities by saying that. Mm-hmm. You really aren't. And actually you need to be doing that very thing instead of saying my oppression is worse than your oppression.
Right. So I'm going to start looking through the chat for your questions. And I should have said earlier to the viewing audience, I feel like such an old school TV host when I say the viewing audience. Hi, internet audience. When you've seen me looking at my phone, that's what I've actually been doing, is trying to monitor things on my phone as our guests continue to talk. While you send me your questions, I would like y'all to talk about the term woke.
Oh, woke. It's such shorthand, it's beginning to mean nothing. Unfortunately.
Well, what did it used to mean?
Good question. I mean, we can go way back to Buddhism and talk about awakening if we want to. We could talk about the Arab Badu song that many people reference, where she's talking about, I'm becoming woke. I'm sure there are other origin stories to that as well. But I think most people use it, and this is a generalization, as a signal to say, oh, I've done my work, I understand, I get it, I'm woke. And actually, if you're in this work, one of the things you know is that you're never done doing your work. I've been doing racial equity and anti-oppression work for over 20 years, and I'm still learning a lot about a lot of things. It's what I like about there's a term that's slowly pushing out the idea of cultural competency. It's called cultural humility. That's actually coined by two doctors here in Oakland out of Children's Hospital, Melody Turbilon and Jan Marie Garza. And they realized with cultural competency, what was happening is that people have thought that you could be competent in somebody else's culture, which is just not true, right? And so this turned cultural humility, the three essence piece of what I really love is one is that learning about other people is a lifelong project. And the first thing you do is not go and try to learn somebody else's stuff, but you check yourself. You check your assumptions. You check the narratives and stories that you've been told about those other folks, right? You do a check on yourself before you even try to engage with the other. For me, and that's such a big piece of like the awakening process. Like if we can coin a new cool term that's more about a process of awakening that's ongoing, I think that would be more appropriate than saying I'm woke. Because saying I'm woke, saying I've done the work and I'm done. The learning curve for all of this stuff is so steep because we are so conditioned by the dominant framework of whiteness, cisness, and all of that other stuff we talked about, right? We have so much to learn about each other's other stuff that's been buried. Like, yes, there's a huge learning curve around fatness and fat liberation. It doesn't get the airtime that it deserves, right? So it's going to be a long time before people really start the process of truly awakening around that, right? So it's problematic because it assumes that you're at an end point. And with anything in life, you're never at an end point of learning.
Caleb, do you want to add anything to that?
I think one thing that, well, since we're speaking of intersectionality, I think that there's an awareness around African American vernacular English that is really important, which is particular dialect that comes out of many Black communities across the U.S. And so part of anti-Black oppression is the assumption that Black culture is a free-for-all for all of us to freely engage with, and one of the ways that non-Black people love to do this is by appropriating words from African American vernacular English. And I think one of those words is woke. Yeah. And woke, I completely agree with your definition. My addition would be that if you're a non-Black person who is using woke, you are probably not as woke as you are, and that you should not be. And there are other, and I think that's just one example in the ways that AAVE, which is shorthand for African American Vernacular English, gets distilled into non-Black culture.
I like the way that burlesque dancer and activist Juicy Delight puts that. She says, if you are not from a community where somebody ever said, "Is you sleep?" and you answered, "No, I'm woke," then it's not your word. Yeah, right. Because that's how it gets used in Black vernacular. Okay, so thank you for your thoughts on wokeness and the term woke. So some questions from our folks out there. This one is from Deb. Do you think that the dominant ideas about fatness are a coded way to continue expressing classist and racist ideas? Sometimes it seems like, especially among progressive white people, aspirational whiteness, in quotation marks, is more about ableism, healthism, and financial wealth.
Yes, it's very possible. The short answer to that is yes, it's very possible that is happening. I think if you look at the beginning of a lot of movements, different types of movements, there was at least two factions that oftentimes happen. The factions that want to assimilate and acculturate into the mainstream, right? And do it's not acceptability. I'm losing my words right now.
Respectability
politics. There's that faction, right? Like, how can we be respectful within the current confines? And then there's the faction that's like, nah, we're not. That's not us. That's not our culture. That's not how we do. That actually breaks us down in ways that are not healthy. We create our own thing, right? In every movement, there's that. Every movement, if you study, that happens.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't it happen in the fat activist movement as well?
Yeah.
And so this is a good time to kind of just check that out and see what side you drop on.
Yeah. I would say absolutely. There's an article, or there's an essay written by Anna Kirkland called The Environmental Account for Obesity, A Case for Feminist Skepticism. And she's a thin white academic who's speaking to other thin white academics being like, hey, y'all love to, like, pathologize people as, like, being fat because they're poor, but you're not looking at all the ways that you have access to resources to maintain not only health but a thin body, which are not the same thing, but something that, and I see this a lot with I also, as a graduate student, I teach undergrads first and second years, and I teach them fat studies material, and I get a lot of this kind of like, yeah, poor people like don't have access to healthy foods, they like eat McDonald's and all this stuff, and they're not thinking about how they likely came from communities that had where they got their groceries at Whole Foods, where they grew up going to the farmers market.
Yeah, there's a huge difference between poor people eat at McDonald's because they're lazy and they don't know how to make good choices versus poor people eat at McDonald's because there's literally no grocery store in their neighborhood, but there are 3 McDonald's there.
Yeah. And so the ways that, like, I think I'm really interested in highlighting the incredible amount of material capital that goes into, for many people, especially as we age, maintaining a thin body necessitates a ton of class privilege in order to access healthy foods, in order to access gyms. And again, not to say that like doing these things will automatically result in a healthy body, but these are the things that people who, I think this is the demographic that you were speaking about earlier, like progressives who really want to hold on to fatphobia and not thinking about their own class privilege frequently that allows them to access these things. And maybe like health is even just a better...
Well, and for me what this brings up is like how that analysis is so individualized versus systematized, right? Like, so why don't we have, so people might say, well, why aren't you taking a bike to work every day? Well, why don't we have good public transportation systems like we do in Europe that actually stop in multiple places and run on time so that everybody can get out of it, regardless of who you are, what your body is, and where you live. Right. So everyone can jump on the train and get to work, or know that if they get on a bus, they're going to get to work on time. Why aren't we talking systemically about that? And you can take that with every issue, and that, to me, that's the big rub I get when I'm in progressive spaces and people talk about individualized behavior. I was just at this wonderful one-day conference about race and climate change and how they totally flipped that paradigm from how, it's all about what individuals do to like, no, it's very hard to like not feed into the system of killing the earth when everything you buy is packaged. Right? And it's based on, a lot of things are based on our labor, exploiting our labor to produce all of these fossil fuels, right? And yet people need those jobs, right? So shifting to systemic is really important in that thinking as well.
Well, and then when we start to look at those systems, I think public transportation is a really interesting example for thinking about intersectionality around fatness and how other movements don't look at us. Because when you start to do things like, how can we get more people on these trains by taking out seats? Then you only have here in the Bay, we have now in our BART trains, which is our subway, some single row seats. And what a single row seat means is that there's one seat this size. And so,
Tiny, y'all.
so what does that mean? You no longer have a bench seat that's the width of quote unquote 2 people, but could also be the width of 1.5 larger people or 1 larger, or whatever, right? Like, you don't have that bench seat anymore that people of multiple sizes could sit in. You have that one individual seat that's the size of an airplane seat, right? And that was the solution to making public transit able to carry more people, was to make the spaces smaller for the, and so then people's response was, right, but that creates more standing space and anybody of any size can stand.
No.
Okay, but not everybody can stand. So now
Right.
we're being ableist. Like, there's all these ways that when we start to look at things systematically, if we don't have an intersectional perspective when we begin to evaluate those systems, then we're still we're recreating systems that are we're just moving who the system is problematic for.
And we're not holding that system accountable, because the real solution, have a real system that has more trains, more places to go, so it's not about packing more people into fewer trains.
Right.
Right? So there's a lack of accountability there.
Are you two able to stay just a few minutes beyond this?
Sure,
So we're going to stay a little beyond the original time since we started late, and I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in. Thank you. If you haven't already sent in a question, we probably won't be able to get to you, but I'm going to combine a couple of the ones that we got. So I'm going to combine questions from Ani and Amanda, and their questions are about, first of all, what should fat liberation be doing to be more intersectional? And then sort of the flip side of that, which is how can fat liberation work as sort of a gateway to really learning how to be less oppressive and more intersectional in other ways? So first, what do we need to do better as a fat community? And then, how can we as a fat community learn what we learned through that anti-oppression work to be better at other anti-oppression work?
Mm.
I hope I've synopsized your two questions in the way that you meant.
What I immediately went to was, I think we have to be fat liberationists outside of the fat liberation movement. I won't say it's easier, but that's a comfort zone there, right? When we have our own events, and that should be there. Every group should have their own shit, right?
Yeah.
Where
That's what I meant earlier by the term affinity space. If
right.
you don't know that.
I mean, I'm not saying those don't exist, but I have to say I do feel, and for good reason I understand, that there's not a lot of folks bringing that into other spaces. So one of the things that, like, for instance, A-Tang and I started doing, and I continue to do, is that we decided to show up at other non-fat, non-people of color dance spaces in the Bay Area and say, we want to be on that stage, and we deserve to be on that stage, right? And we're going to show up fat and everything on that stage, right? I think we have to strategically figure out how to do more of that. And I know that's scary, and I feel really, really blessed to have a partner doing that with A-Tang. So where we can, we should support each other. So when a sister of size is doing a show or in a show, go support her and let her know you're there to support them or him or her, whatever, right? Because that's a scary space.
Yeah.
Right? And yet we need to be doing that. We need to be doing that, right? I hunger. I want to see more of that. So there's part of me that says we need to figure out how to be outside our comfort zone a little bit and figure out how to make that doable for us. So that's one thing that comes to mind around, how do we spread that good gospel?
Yeah, I think something that has been so guiding for me is another Audre Lorde quote she was invoked earlier. And another thing she said was, I'm not free while any other woman isn't free, even if her chains are very different from mine. Mm-hmm. And what that means for me is taking a very personal investment in the liberation of others that experience oppressions that I don't. And so it means not only expanding my fat analysis to think about the different intersections that occur there, but also showing up for folks even if it's not immediately relevant to how this is about fatness or whatever. Like, we can't just stay siloed into another really good word that was done earlier, into our own individual things that we need to, like, be showing up for survivors and for Black Lives Matter and for decolonial works and for prisoners and for the pipeline. There's so many areas, like, for fat liberation for me necessitates the liberation of all of these other systems. And so we have to take really personal investments beyond, again, we can't just individualize these things, because if we as individuals are okay, that doesn't mean that everybody is still okay. And in fact, if we're okay, that means we might have more space to fight for others who aren't. And yeah, that is what I think, how we can synthesize those.
Are there some things that should just take priority over fat liberation? Like, are there some, you mentioned some things like things that immigrants in this country are facing right now, things like the pipeline and things that affect our environment that could potentially kill the planet and all of us. Like, what difference does it make if fat people are free if the planet is dead? Like, shouldn't we just make sure we do that first?
Fatness isn't all of that. Really, I'm very serious.
Yeah.
The fatness, trans, queer. I mean, I what's going on at the border and in the detention center. There's not a lot of talk about how the trans people have been killed and tortured in detention centers, right? And I'm sure that there's also targeting of fat folks too.
Yeah.
So, like, I think we make an assumption, again, we silo, right? Because it makes things simple. And, like, what you find is what you thought wasn't there, it actually is there.
Yeah.
Right? And it makes a difference if you bring your fat self to the fight. Mm-hmm. Right? Then that brings the issue inherently.
I think that feels like a really great time to point out the Fatties Against Fascism group here.
Mm-hmm.
That's started here in the Bay Area, and you can find them on your favorite social media site, Fatties Against Fascism. But that explicitly said, like, we are fat. That's our thing. That's our common bond. And we're going to fight this other thing together. Mm-hmm. But we're also going to do that as a fat visibility project so that we are feeding two birds with one piece of bread, right? Mm-hmm. Like, doing this work and doing that work at the same time.
I love that reframing. I just want to highlight that, feeding two birds with one piece of bread.
I brought that from poet Ikiri Talley, who I went to graduate school with, who I used the phrase kill two birds with one stone, and they were like, that's super violent. Yeah. And is that really what you wanted to say about this thing?
Right.
And so I've tried to use that phrase instead since then. What about, so again, I'm going to combine two questions. One is from Brenna, who wants to know about preferred terms to talk about the oppression of fat people. Do we like fatphobia? Do we like the term fatphobia? Do we like the term fat oppression, fat stigma? What are the things that you think are useful? And then from Bill Fabry, who is, hi Bill, who Bill is the founder of NAAFA. And who thanks you and wishes you all had been around 50 years ago to have these conversations in the beginning. What about people who still find the word fat really painful? How do we talk about fat oppression if people don't even want to use the word fat?
Yeah. The first question again?
What are the preferred terms or your preferred terms for talking about fat, collective fat oppression? And then second part, how do we talk about that if people don't even want to use the word fat?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I use as kind of like a generic overlay systemic oppression to capture all of the isms because they're all existing systems. I think that stigma is really useful because stigmatizing is what we're really trying to explode, right? That element of it. For people who find fat, I think, it's a journey, y'all, right? Like, and everyone is in their place on the continuum of their journey. And I think we spend way too much time trying to convince people that they should be on the journey. And not that, and I'm saying this not because I don't think that they're savable, but like from my experience with work I've done both personally and professionally around issues of, for instance, addiction, you got to admit that you have an issue before you can address it. Mm. And I can't admit that like how the world treats me because I'm fat is an issue. No amount of facts and statistics and scholarly knowledge and is going to convince me of that. Right? I have to come to it in my own way. And like, you can be ready and available for when that person's ready to go there, but you can't make them ready. And I think we spend a lot of time trying to make people ready. Now, that said, I do think we should create the conditions for when they are ready, there's something to embrace them. Right? And for those who are already ready to be there, to be in there. And so they can see models of people doing great things and being out about their fatness and embracing it, right? So let's put that energy into creating those conditions and to being models. So when people are ready, they can step out and do that. But like with all of these things, like it amazes me every year that I do, for instance, racial equity work. There are 2 or 3 people who come to me who come out of the closet about being a person of color. There's still people passing in 2018. Mm-hmm. Right? You would think that like that would be one thing that wouldn't be happening anymore.
Do y'all know? I mean, y'all, if you're not familiar with the concept of passing, it's when somebody who is white presenting, someone who has heritage in groups that are people of color, but looks to other people like they are white, just goes forward being white and doesn't reveal to people their background, right?
So I say that in that to say you could think that conditions are perfect for people to like be who they want to be, but if you're not having that person's life, if they're not ready, you can't make them ready. Mm-hmm. All we can do is create the conditions so when they're ready, they can.
So what about people who are not fat, who want to be respectful of politicized fat folks by using the term fat because that's what we use, but who are also aware that as non-fat people themselves, when they use the term, other people might hear it as an insult. Mm-hmm. What are they supposed to say?
About fat liberation?
Or even about fat, like how do they use the word fat? Like what words do they use?
A mere descriptor?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, this has been a project of fat activism for a long time, is destigmatizing the word and like interrogating what we mean by, particularly what's uncomfortable about the word fat and what is uncomfortable about our association with it. Yeah, and I think that interrogation is really important because if you are afraid of the word fat, you are probably still, or there must be some association with it that's negative that needs to be.
Yeah, and like how you feel about your ability to engage in that conversation with others when they challenge you on it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
So can you say, I mean it in terms, when I use it, here's what I mean, right? And also just be open and willing to be wrong.
Right.
I mean, that's a big lesson that I have to check myself on when it comes to stuff that's not about me, like using pronouns, right? Like, you know, when I first encountered that years ago, I thought it was some white folks stuff. And like I had to check myself and sit and listen and be willing to be wrong about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think just going back to what you just said about like your willingness or your preparation to be able to engage people around the terminology that you're using. I remember when last year Bertha Pearl and Saucy West joined me here at this same office in downtown Oakland to do a webinar on fat fashion. And when Saucy showed up, she told the security person, you know, I'm here to do this fat fashion thing. And the security person corrected her and said, oh, no, you mean a plus-size fashion thing. Now, if y'all know Saucy at all, of course, Saucy said, no, what I mean is a fat fashion thing. right? But not everybody is ready to do that or prepared to do that. And then I think, especially for people who do not present as fat, they feel especially like, well, if I correct this fat person, like this fat person that I said fat to just told me I'm not allowed to say that, I think they're politically wrong, but we're talking about their body right now, you know, like, so it's complicated. And so I think what you said about like being willing to be wrong, or sometimes being willing to shut up even if you know you're right, because there's a lot of tension between body autonomy and body politics, right? Yes. And when we think we've got the right politic and somebody else is using their autonomy in the wrong way, it's challenging, right? Like, and
so like,
ways it is challenging.
A parallel example is in the Black community using Black, African American, Afro, even colored, Negro, right? Those are generational words, actually, right? And they have a lot of meaning to people. You know, a lot of meaning to people. And like, so there's, for me, it's like when someone says, no, I don't use Black, I use African American, I hear that there's some meaning behind that for that person. Right? And I'm not going to challenge their experience with that. I use Black. Right? But there's meaning behind that. And so we can have a conversation. I think part of this is like, we're so unwilling in this country to have real conversations with each other. That's not about competition, but about inquiry and collaboration. And we don't know how to do that for the most part. The way that our society is set up, you look at all of the debate shows on TV news, it's about who can and let's not even talk about online discussions. It's all about one-upism. And it's not really about, I'm engaging you so I can maybe learn something, and maybe you can learn something from me. And, you know, it's not about necessarily who's right, although there may be some rightness in it. But, like, I want to engage. I'm building this relationship. So I think it takes a lot of practice to go against that norm. And it's also about setting the conditions so other people can engage. Right? If we don't have the conversation publicly, then we can't change the conditions.
Yeah.
Right? And, like, the first thing you got to do is at least have a public conversation.
Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
I think you really summed it up well.
Okay. So I can see that there's a question. I think I missed the beginning of the question, Avery. I'm going to try to ask the end of your question. I can only see things from where I came into the chat, so it looks like y'all were maybe talking about this a little bit more before. But the question from Avery is about, or Avery mentions that it is sometimes really useful to make parallels between, now I've lost it, sorry, sometimes really useful. Learning about other instances of oppression is also useful to identify parallel cases. And Avery cites an example of somebody talking about not hating fat people, just hating fat behavior, and how that phrasing is used against other communities. I think in the particular conversation y'all were having maybe about religion, but we definitely know how that phrasing can be used against gay people, right? Like, I don't hate the sinner, I hate the sin. So it's useful for us sometimes to see where there are those parallels. So talk about where it's useful to see the parallels, and then also I'm interested always in talking to people about where it's problematic to make those parallels. Could you just share some thoughts about those things?
I think for me, like, I moved away from a need to censor fat. I don't know if this is necessarily true. I'm not going to say that, but I will say I've moved more towards a framework of oppression and thinking about why it is okay to oppress people. And I think that that becomes a more productive question because it allows us to think about these parallels and also see that the problem is not race and that some people have like a particular kind of race or gender or sexuality, right? The problem is that we have inherited this world that thinks it's okay to oppress people. And that oppression works in similar ways across different identities. And so if we can find those parallels of how, yes, this is a way that oppression works Because this is the way oppression works, right? And like this is the way it comes. I hope I'm making sense and not just like repeating myself. But I think that we can pull back and be like, the problem is not actually like these individual instances. The problem is oppression itself. Parallels, I think, help highlight that. And that way we can also begin to think about our own, I want to say our own privileges in the sense of what we are really, still really comfortable, where we are still comfortable oppressing others, right? Because that's also a part of privilege, is gaining some sort of feeling superior to another person. Yeah, so I just want to, I'm trying to think less about like, the specificities of fatness are important, but it's more about the fact that like, we just live in a world where we think it's okay to treat others badly and wrongly, and like that's a problem. And it's going to show up in all these different ways.
Yeah, I do think there's a need to have a discussion about values that oftentimes causes you to use parallels, like I did with just what I just did, like in terms of labeling, right, with African Americans, whatnot. When it comes to trying to really figure out solutions and alternatives, I think this is where the complexity comes in, and that where we have to embrace it, right? Because the solution around what happens with an ethnic group is not going to be the solution that happens with Black folks, right? And so there's a need for nuance there, and a need for understanding the history and how things manifest when a system is out to get you, right? So I think on a level of values, there are basic values that should go across identities. Like, no, we should not be oppressing people because of anything, right? And we can use some parallels to really draw those points out. But when we start thinking about, well, how do we actually get at this problem? How do we undo the system?
Yeah.
Then people want to go to the place of everything is everything. You know, and it's like, no, because there was a very specific strategical thing done to oppress those people.
Right.
Yeah, and you have to know that in order to undo that. And those people, because of their culture and who they are, actually need something very specific.
Right.
Right? And like that's where cultural humility comes into play, and you sit and listen and learn and say, oh, that's the nuance difference. So now I can help these people this way, and I can help these people. And because I'm helping them, and that's what equity is about. That's how I define equity. Equity is meeting the needs. It's not just this, and people conflate it with equality, which usually means equal portions for everybody. Sameness. Things can be sane and unfair. Things can be equal and unfair. And that's a hard concept for social justice community, because for decades now we have had equality as part of our language, right? And no, I don't want to be treated just like a man. I don't. I got some nuances that I want respected, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. There is absolutely nothing. In fact, everything is right about that. If I, the analogy I use, I'm inviting people to dinner, I want to know who has special, needs nutritionally. A baby needs breast milk. 40-year-old woman may need an iron-rich salad with some protein on top. An athlete may need to carb up before the race. They get something radically different, but they get their nutritional needs met. That's equity. But in order for me to know that, I got to do some research. I got to shut up and listen. I got to not say, oh, I'm just feeding beautiful people at my house. No.
Well, and what you also have to do is not just be like, and they should be grateful I'm giving them some food, right? That's a thing that we often do around anti-oppression. Is like, well, anything that I give you should be good. This is one of the things we see come up a lot with fat fashion, where like a designer says, I'm going to embrace all bodies, and look at my size 18 that I make because I'm so great. And then when people are like, well, actually, how about that size 32 or bigger? And they're like, you should just be glad I made this 18. Everybody else isn't making an 18, right? And so there's also that. And that's challenging sometimes, too, because we are glad you made an 18. And that is better than what was happening before.
Right.
But how do we affirm you in that and also push you to do something else?
Absolutely.
And also check you for using a term like everybody when you really still only mean half the bodies? And like, so it's complicated and nuanced all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a big key to all of this is that, like, you have to not just reject simplification, but embrace complexity in a real way. Like, there's some stuff it's going to take me a while to understand, stuff I don't know about, stuff that, like, actually puts us at loggerheads at times, and we need to take a deep breath and figure it out.
Yeah, and I think one of the other dangers of parallels is these oversights of intersectionality is if we say, right, we talked about, like, this rhetoric around fat people also is the same as, like, this rhetoric of gay people, or that it negatively impacts gay people, and then we forget about the fat gay people, right? And so, like, that parallel is just, like, inherently, or parallels can be just, like, inadequate. Like, you know, they're useful to find connections and those things, but they're also, they smooth over some of these nuances.
Yeah, well, and it's very different to make the parallel from your own lived experience of multiple identities than to be the outsider making that parallel, right? So, like, when people were like, can we all just stop calling other people the Rosa Parks of anything?
Oh,
like,
wow.
Can we just stop doing that? Like, that was a thing, and it was its own thing. But at the same time, it's completely different. If you were a part of the Montgomery bus boycott with Rosa Parks, and you want to say, when we, all the people who went into this boycott, because it wasn't just Rosa, but that's a whole other subject, like, when we planned this whole big movement, I was part of that. And I want to compare it to this other movement that I'm now part of. That is very different than when somebody else just looks at it from the outside and says, that's just like that time Rosa Parks was tired. Right? Because it's not your lived experience. And so I think what happens sometimes is that folks who have multiple identities do make those comparisons, and then other people forget that doesn't mean that you should try to just make those comparisons.
And just put a fine point on that, the reason you may not want to do that is that there's so much nuance and understanding that you don't know. Like, most people don't know the full history of Rosa Parks.
Right.
That brought her to that moment and after that moment. So when you say that, does it really mean that? Do you really know that? You don't know. You don't know that history, right? So, like, and those nuances matter. Yeah,
they matter a lot. So I want to thank y'all for such a nuanced and complicated conversation. And I know that we probably didn't get to everything people are wondering about. And, you know, there's always more to say about privilege and intersectionality and about our work as activists. I want to encourage y'all to, how can they find you if they want to hear more from you and your work?
On Facebook, my business, Art Work Practice, has a Facebook page that you can join. Or you can go to artworkpractice.com and join the email list there. And we also have the same Twitter handle.
Caleb, how can folks find you?
I have a website, caleb-luna.com. Also, I mostly post on Instagram under the handle Chairbreaker.
Okay, and you can find me personally I'm on Instagram and Facebook as I of the Tigress. That's letter I of the Tigress, and then of course you can find NAAFA at NAAFA.org, and there's also NAAFA Facebook page and various NAAFA groups that you can join. I once again want to thank you all for being with us. Want to thank my fellow board members for supporting the webinar series, and all of our all of our NAAFA contributors and members whose memberships do help us keep things like this free and open to the public. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the NAAFA website. So if you have people that you think would like to have seen it who were not able to join in live, you'll be able to share those links. And thank you for joining us today. We will be back in November with a topic to be determined and a date to be determined, but we will be back in November. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to end with one of the terms that came up during our discussion was respectability politics, and something I think is really, that term refers to the ways in which we expect people to behave correctly in order to be acceptable as activists or acceptable in sharing their truths. And one of the things that I know that happens to fat people around respectability politics is we're not supposed to eat in front of other people.
Oh.
And so we're going to end by sharing a donut together, sharing as many donuts as we want together. I hope that you eat something fabulous that works for you and that you love, and you do that unapologetically today because you're allowed to do that. And we will see you next month. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Donut.
Give me a donut.
What that is?
Ooh.
I already have like one of them.
Yeah, what's the best? What's the best?
My personal favorite is the Fruity Pebble donut.
It's Fruity Pebble.
Yes, that is, again, my...
Jealousy.
I'm going to get a classic
vegan donut.
here.
Green tea.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, is this bacon?
That's bacon? Really?
It's vegan bacon.
What?
Bye, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Bye.
I was going to say, how is it bacon if it's